All right, good afternoon, class. Today we're going to be talking about instruction and augmented feedback. This is chapter 15 of your textbook. Feedback is a general term used to describe the information a learner receives about his or her performance of a movement or skill. Feedback is not the only intervention strategy that can be employed to correct errors. As we know, we can also manipulate the task and or practice environment in order to attempt to correct errors. But today we're going to be talking specifically about feedback. We're also going to be looking at the role of augmented feedback in motor skill acquisition. Is it essential? And then we'll discuss knowledge of performance and knowledge of results, and even descriptive and prescriptive cueing or feedback. So the benefits of feedback: error correction, right? Reinforcement of a newly learned motor skill, and then of course motivation. And so really the feedback serves two distinct roles, right? It can provide information that facilitates the achievement of the goal of the skill. So that would be error correction and also reinforcement, right? And then it can motivate the learner to continue striving towards the goal, right? So motivation and again, reinforcement. And reinforcement can be positive, that the ball went into the hole. But it could also be negative. So imagine learning to drive a manual transmission, right? So after several times of stalling and jerking the car around, you start to pick up on the fact that, hey, this needs to come before this, or this needs to be, release the clutch softly, things like that. So certainly having your car stall is negative reinforcement, but that can also motivate the learner and then also provide error correction. So my first question for you, and you can follow along, you have a quiz on Learn, so we can go through this together. So the sensory perceptual information that is a natural part of performing a skill is known as this type of feedback. So is it quantitative, qualitative, task extrinsic? So is it external, or is it task intrinsic, internal? So I'll give you a second to think about that. Right, so the answer is D. It's task intrinsic. And if we look at this hierarchy of feedback, it's divided into two categories. You have the task intrinsic feedback and then your augmented feedback. And so the task intrinsic really is any of your sensory information, your visual, auditory, proprioceptive, or tactile, all those mechanoreceptors that are providing you feedback internally, versus augmented feedback, which we're primarily going to speak about today. Knowledge of results, so giving someone sort of more quantitative data, versus knowledge of performance, giving them a cue or some indication of, why the outcome was as it was. All right, so let's look at knowledge of results and knowledge of performance in more detail. So knowledge of results is feedback that provides the learner with information about the outcome. Okay, so now this can be qualitative or quantitative, but typically we would see it as you ran 5 seconds faster that time, or you were off the blocks 0.05 seconds faster than the last time. Knowledge of performance is information regarding the specific characteristics of the performance that led to that outcome, right? So, and the knowledge of performance is mostly concerned with the success of the intended action with respect to its goal. So a coach might tell a long jumper that his plant foot was 4 centimeters over the takeoff board. And a therapist could tell a patient that his functional reach had improved by 20%. So what do you think? Would those be knowledge of results or knowledge of performance statements? So I'd say in that case where a coach was telling a long jumper that his plant foot was 4 centimeters over the takeoff board, that would probably be a knowledge of results statement. And also telling a patient that their functional reach had improved by 20% would be a knowledge of result statement. Okay, so now your task is to identify the knowledge of results or knowledge of performance statements. So from a golf instructor, your shot went into the right rough versus you began your downswing before you finished your backswing. So take a look at those two statements. And then from a physical therapist, you walked 10 feet further today than yesterday, or you should bend your knees more as you walk. So what do you think? Knowledge of results or knowledge of performance? Okay. So your shot went into the right rough, the knowledge of results, right? So chances are, if the golfer had seen it, but perhaps the golfer hadn't seen it, the instructor is just saying, here's where your ball went. But, giving actual, here's why your ball went to the right rough would be more of a knowledge of performance statement. You began your downswing before you finished your backswing. And then from a physical therapist, bending your knees more as you walk, that would certainly be knowledge of performance. And then giving them a quantitative value, you walk 10 feet further today than yesterday, that would be a knowledge of result or a KR statement. So question 2 on the learn assignment is to determine whether the following augmented feedback statements are examples of knowledge of results or knowledge of performance statements. All right, so I'm just going to show you these quickly because you'll do this on your own, right? So your foot placement on the beam should be more angled. Looking down to F, you need to let the weight down more slowly, etc. All right, so you go ahead and choose if those are knowledge of results or knowledge of performance statements. All right, so how essential is augmented feedback for skill acquisition? Well, there are 4 different answers, so 4 different schools of thought. Number 1, it may not be necessary for skill learning. Right, it might depend on the learner. If the learner is an advanced learner, they might rely mostly on that task intrinsic, right, their own sensory perception and their own body movements. However, there's also the school that thinks it can enhance skill learning, right? So certainly in a beginner or even in an individual with some sort of deficit, augmented feedback, having an external source tell you how you were doing can certainly benefit learning of a new skill. There's schools that say it could hinder or slow skill learning. And so again, that would depend on the individual if the type of feedback is not correct, right? So we talked a bit about, giving external cues versus internal cues and how, kind of doing something or mirroring, imitating can actually hinder long-term learning, right? But then, of course, there is it can be absolutely essential for skill learning. And so when is augmented feedback necessary? There's no choice. You, as an instructor, a personal trainer, a physical therapist, you have no choice. You're going to have to sort of be an individual's, external source of information. And that is when the task intrinsic or their sensory information is somehow disrupted. So in a situation like a stroke, a disease like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, it's going to be beneficial to that patient or participant to have some sort of external feedback. All right. There are 3 situations where a person may not be able to use important task intrinsic feedback effectively, right? So again, this is our sensory information. So some skill performance contexts do not make critical sensory feedback available to a person. And so this is even in, an ambulatory person or a person, whose sensory pathways are just fine. It would be something like a very long golf shot, right? You can't actually physically see your ball, or you're standing and a tree is between you and where your shot would have been. So something like that. Your vision is impaired, or you can't hear. There's a large crowd, something like that. So it would be important in that situation for an instructor to give augmented feedback. We've talked about the no sensory pathways due to injury or disease. And then we have the person is capable of detecting sensory information, but cannot use intrinsic feedback due to lack of experience. And so this is what we see in a very young or novice learner, right? They just don't know how they should feel and what they should see or what they should hear. And so giving them feedback and allowing them to sort of explore what their own movement is doing can allow them to sort of say, okay, that feels right. So question 3, When is augmented feedback necessary? Select all that apply. And so on your Learn quiz, you'll go through and select, you'll go through and select the appropriate answers. All right, so knowledge of performance. So knowledge of performance can be beneficial for skill learning. Here are some situations where you may be encouraged to give knowledge of performance. So I'm sorry I just sort of presented this all at once, but if you want to give knowledge of performance to a learner, where specific skills must be performed according to specific movement characteristics, right? So identifying new coordination patterns, right? So that would be number 2 here. Specific movement components of skills that require complex coordination must be improved or corrected. So think of some of the Olympic lifts, right? You really have to, drive with the hips, and that's not a natural thing for individuals to get right off the bat. And so that these knowledge of performance sort of reasons why we would use them are all fairly similar. The goal of the action is to produce a specific kinematic, kinetic, or muscle activity profile, right? So we can, of course, test that, looking at motion capture or EMG. But again, it's what fires first, right? And then if we would maybe want to stick to knowledge of performance statements, if the knowledge of result is redundant with the task intrinsic feedback, right? So if a shot is missed, and the individual can clearly see that their shot was missed, you don't necessarily need to give them knowledge of results, but perhaps you could give them some information about, why they missed that shot. So question 4 is just a short answer, and just be very brief, but I'd like you to think of a motor skill and tell me what some of that feedback regarding performance, so knowledge of performance that you may give your client, athlete, fellow student, whatever. Okay, so just very briefly, just identify the motor skill and then just give me a knowledge of performance statement specific to that motor skill. All right, so here are some situations where we might want to use knowledge of results. And again, I'm so sorry that it's just all presented at once. Typically a learner will often use the knowledge of results, especially if they know the goal, ball to the net, ball in the hole. And hopefully you've given them some space to work on that task intrinsic feedback, figuring out, what their body movements should feel like. But it might be beneficial to just kind of say, hey, you were 2 feet off or something like that. Learners, especially beginning learners, might need knowledge of results because they can't determine the outcome of performing a skill on the basis of the available task intrinsic feedback. Okay, so this is very beginning learners who don't really have that sensory perception, right? And then third, learners can use knowledge of results to motivate themselves. So certainly if you keep making that shot over and over and over again, you kind of get motivated to do even more and get even better and more consistent. And then lastly, providing only knowledge of results. So this is not knowledge of performance. You're not telling a learner how they should feel. You're not telling a learner what they should look like. You're not telling a learner that they need to move their arm faster or whatever. You're just giving them the knowledge of that result. How fast they ran, how quick they were off the block, how far away they were from the target. This can help establish discovery learning. And we've talked about this before, where you really just give the learner or athlete space to figure out what works best for them so they can become more consistent in their own right. And so the next question I have for you, question 5, is another short answer. Again, keep it very brief. So using the motor skill from the previous exercise, right? So go ahead and identify the skill again, and then give me a knowledge of result statement that you could use for that particular skill for your learner. Okay. Question 6, providing only knowledge of results may help to ensure that learners adopt an external focus of attention as they practice the skill. Okay. I would just like you to address in maybe 1 or 2 sentences why an external focus of attention is beneficial. So come up with maybe 1 or 2 reasons that we've talked about throughout the term, again, as far as leaving a learner alone to kind of figure things out on their own. Okay, so what kind of feedback? Do we really want to focus on the bad, or do we only want to reinforce the good, or just bring forward the good? Well, error feedback, right? By providing a learner with performance error, they can actually facilitate skill acquisition. So again, they're kind of figuring out their own, okay, I was, I overshot by 5, right? And they can figure out, well, that felt like this, and so maybe I should try this next time, right? So just giving them error will actually allow them to sort of adopt their own pattern and figure things out, figure that out on their own. Providing learner with just the correct features of the performance attempt. That was... If you want to motivate, that should actually say, if you want to motivate your learner, if you want to encourage persistence, the practice, you as the instructor should focus on the learner's achievements and highlight the correct features of their performance attempt. So the first one, if you really want the learner to get the skill down, give them the error. This is where you were, this is how far you were off. But if you want to motivate the learner and really just encourage them to keep trying, you want to focus on the correct features of performance, right? But ideally, we would incorporate both into feedback. And this is something that Cheryl Coker calls the sandwich approach, right? So she's a motor learning specialist. And so I think you might have heard this as far as, any kind of critique, right? You say something good, and then you say something not so good, and then, back to good, right? So you leave everything on a positive note. Well, this is a similar approach where you're giving the error correction information between a reinforcing statement and a motivating statement. So, the first thing that you want to do is you want to give them information to reinforce the correct performance. So this could be a knowledge of result statement or even a knowledge of performance statement, right? Or it could be something like, that was really good. You were, only 5 inches away from the hole, right? So something kind of positive and maybe giving them just a little bit of information about that trial. And then we go ahead and give them the error correction information. So now we give them information in which to facilitate the error correction. So, keep your head down, softer on the backswing, things like that. And then lastly, we want to continue to motivate the learner to, continue to keep trying and work through those error and correction recommendations. Good job, you're almost there, whatever. Okay, so that would be the sandwich approach. So for an example, from say like a dancer might say something like, hey, how did that look? I think I was able to keep my pelvis in line that time, right? So this is probably an advanced learner who is, very focused or, very aware of what she should feel like when executing a movement, right? And so an instructor might say, good, your pelvis was in line that time, to reinforce the correct performance. And then the error correction statement, on this next trial, try to maintain your outward rotation, blah, blah, blah. Your stability will improve and it will be easier to turn, right? So now, the instructor is giving that error correction statement. And then lastly, just the encouragement to motivate the learner to keep striving, right? And working towards those goals. You give them this encouraging, you almost have it statement. All right, so for your next task, question 7, I would like you to rewrite the following statement using the sandwich technique. So no, you are doing it all wrong. When you hit the ball, you have to be facing your target. How many times do I have to tell you? Right, so this sounds, I don't know about any of you, but this kind of sounds like my dad trying to teach me how to play golf when I was 10. But what I would like you to do is rewrite that statement into that sandwich technique. So, again, Number one, information reinforcing the correct performance, then providing that error correction statement, and then offering some words of encouragement. All right, so let's compare next descriptive versus prescriptive feedback. So descriptive feedback, our knowledge of performance, it's a statement that describes only the error a person has made during the performance of a skill. So really, you're just giving them some facts. You're sticking to the facts and not necessarily giving them any additional information. Whereas a prescriptive statement describes errors made during the performance of a skill, right? And also gives the prescription or what needs to be done to correct those errors. Right, so take a look at that. And then question 8, so knowing these definitions now, you're going to determine whether the augmented feedback statements are examples of descriptive or prescriptive feedback. So we can look at a few of these together. Like for instance, A here, your plant foot is landing too far in front of you. Okay, well that's not really giving the learner any information on how to correct that issue. Clearly there is an issue or you wouldn't be telling me, right? So I'm going to say that's more of a descriptive statement, right? Whereas B, when you release the ball, continue to flex your wrist so that your fingers are pointing to the ground, right? So there was an issue. The instructor is addressing that, hey, there was an issue, but then they're giving you some helpful information to try to correct that error. So that would be a prescriptive statement. So I would say A was descriptive and B would be prescriptive. Okay, so I'll let you tackle C and H yourself. All right. Question 9. This is a potential exam question. In the context of augmented feedback, I would like you to identify a true statement about error information. Is it independent of skill learning? Is it more effective for facilitating skill learning? Is it insufficient to produce optimal skill learning? Or less effective in terms of durability of skill learning? So giving a learner information about their errors is essentially what the question is asking. And the answer is B. It is more effective for facilitating skill learning. So it does turn out that we like to know about the mistakes that we make. So whether we can adjust that intrinsically, right, through our sensations, or just even, receive motivation and encouragement by, getting closer to the target next time. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit and discuss video replays. So Herbert Landon and Menekele, I think that's how you say that, they developed sort of this list or distinct stages that a learner, especially a beginner learner, might go through while watching a video replay. So a beginner learner starting out and then, of course, becoming hopefully more advanced, and how beginners and advanced learners do see themselves differently or take in information differently from video replays. And Darden actually came up with some very just distinct, succinct wording for these stages. And so there are 4 distinct stages. Number 1 is the shock stage. So a beginning learner, assessing themselves in a video tends to be preoccupied with their appearance, right? They tend to notice things that are completely irrelevant to the task at hand, what they were wearing, how they look, etc. But as they progress and get a little bit more comfortable with video and also more comfortable in their task, they start to identify specific performance errors. And this is where a learner really does start to distinguish between those task relevant and the task irrelevant conditions. And when I say task relevant, I'm talking about those regulatory conditions that matter, right? Versus, say, a non-regulatory condition that just isn't going to influence performance. The next stage is the error correction stage. So not only here is a learner able to identify their error and begin to understand why it occurred, the educator or instructor has this opportunity to enhance a learner's problem-solving skills. So not only just having the learner watch themselves and identify their own errors. But this is a great opportunity for, say, an instructor to say, okay, well, what would you do different? Right. And so in video replays, especially in beginner learners, it's very important to have an instructor present. So until you become very adept at a skill, it's very good to have an instructor there, either to be a sounding board or, again, offer some helpful suggestions about movement correction. And then the last stage is the independent stage. There's very little dependency on that instructor feedback. And so this is where, an advanced volleyball player, watching their technique, they can just kind of roll off to the side, ask for a replay, look at what they did wrong, and kind of figure out what they need to do or how they need to feel in order to correct that. So learners at this stage can identify and correct their own errors and really don't need a lot of instructor feedback. So I put up a hyperlink here, the synchronized swimming camera, which I thought was incredibly interesting. So if you know anything about synchronized swimmers, a lot of the action, or what we see as spectators, happens on top of the water. And they're, I guess, relatively recently, it's been a while, they've developed this sort of twin cam where you can see what's happening under the water as well as what's happening above the water. And so even as a spectator, as a judge, you can see sort of the magic and the amazing athletic ability of these athletes. And of course, synchronized swimmers, for as long as underwater cameras have been around, have been watching their own performance and figuring things out, and especially when it comes to timing with the other women in their group or their partners. All right, so please check that out. I thought it was a very good video, very well done video, by the Olympic Committee, and it features Spain, actually. Okay. So when is augmented feedback? When is it too much of a good thing? So there's something called the guidance hypothesis, and it says that augmented feedback on every trial guides the learner to successful performance. Okay, it's like a direct shot to greatness, but it can result in poor learning. And so, just like using a mirror in the gym, right? Especially as you're learning to lift and you're constantly watching yourself in a mirror, you become heavily reliant on the feedback that you're getting from, seeing your image, right? And it makes it difficult to say advanced or to kind of break away from utilizing that mirror. Okay, so the guidance hypothesis essentially is stating that the learner becomes dependent on this feedback, right? They're dependent on this external feedback, which can lead to poor performance when the feedback is withdrawn. So question 10, research shows that when learners can self-select, when they receive augmented feedback, they typically ask for it. Is it frequently and after good trials, frequently and after poor trials, infrequently and after good trials, or infrequently and after poor trials? What do you think? Well, it turns out that when learners ask for feedback, they might actually go through several trials before asking for feedback, but it tends to be after good trials. Right. So it seems like, leave me alone for a little bit. I'm tossing my beanbag here, figuring things out. Hey, was that good? How was my form on that? Okay, keep tossing. Yeah, that was good, right? Things like that. So we tend to, when we get to self-select when we want feedback, right? Our coach is just kind of off to the side. We tend to select it infrequently, but typically after good trials. Like we tend to know what the objective is and what it should look like. But being that feedback, even though that our last lab didn't necessarily demonstrate the results, I guess, that were hypothesized, which is that the knowledge of results after every 5 trials should have performed better. So according to your text, constantly receiving feedback isn't necessarily a good thing. Receiving it less frequently is better. But because of that, we do have because that is studied in actual scientific experiments, we do have some techniques that reduce the frequency of augmented feedback. Right, so some of these are self-selected schedules. So backing off and letting the learner determine when they want feedback, right? And of course, we can hypothesize that they're going to want it infrequently and after the good trials. And then this right here, this is a study looking at giving like summary of results and then an averaged over time or averaged over trials augmented feedback result. And we can see as far as, here's our acquisition stage. This is where individuals are practicing a target task. And this, they're looking at absolute constant error, which essentially is absolute error, right? They're looking at absolute error here. And then they have this sort of these retention trials. And so they have this kind of shortly after, and then, more time has passed. And what was the best as far as removing a feedback or clustering feedback, what was the best? And looking at error, because we want the lowest possible error, we can see that as far as long-term results, the sum of every 15. So we might give the average of every 15 trials, say versus after every single trial or every 5th trial. So it seems like the longer, the less feedback, it went from, here most feedback, second most, third, and then finally, the lowest error actually occurred when the least amount of feedback was given. So that would be an example of the summary and averaged augmented feedback. Performance-based bandwidths. Now, this is going to be very helpful for you as trainers and as therapists, even as instructors, moving forward into your careers. And this is essentially where we have this bandwidth, sort of this correction range, right? So we have a woman here who's, performing a squat, and she looks great, actually. I mean, nice and deep, head position, but here's her instructor helping her out. And so there's this sort of optimal positioning of where she should be. But then the instructor is going to back off. And if she sees any kind of deviation, maybe there's a mobility limitation. She's not, down as far as, you would like, right? It's not picture perfect, but there's this bandwidth, this sort of, you're going to give her this area here, right? So if the knees go in just a little bit, if she's not, sitting back all the way, if she's a little bit more forward, you're not really going to start providing feedback until, it gets, she's out of control, right? Actually, this would be like she's out of control, because we really, especially as a learner is moving or progressing in a skill, we want to give them space. And certainly there's going to be some limitations, especially if you're working with elderly, or children even. There's going to be some limitations in what they are and are not capable of. And so we want to give them some freedom. And so this light green here is sort of our bandwidth. We have optimal, but then we have, error on either side that we're just going to leave them alone and let happen and see if they can figure that out on their own. And we're not going to start intervening and until things start to maybe become, a little bit too out of our range, or, even over here unsafe, right? Because this would be, okay, let's try something new. So that would be, the performance-based bandwidth technique of giving feedback without having to give it after every trial, really just allowing the participant space to make their own errors. So question 11, when you give a person augmented feedback based on performance bandwidth, you give feedback only when the person's performance is what? Outside the specific range of correctness, within a specific range of correctness, outside or within a specific range of correctness, or if it's correct and only correct. So hopefully I did an okay job of explaining that, and you selected A, right? So outside the specific range of correctness, right? So you've given them some leeway, just you wanted to make sure that they were still staying safe and preserving their joints as much as possible. Last question for you from your quiz on Learn. Of course, there's an exception to every rule. When might the reduction of frequency of augmented feedback not be beneficial? I think I probably could have worded that better, but hopefully you get the gist of it. Right, so we don't want to reduce it. We don't necessarily want to give a correction range. We don't necessarily, we might have to continue giving feedback after every trial. What do you think? We can't rely on them to self-select. Really just, kind of have to stay on top of them and act like an external brain. And that, of course, is when there are proprioceptive or sensory deficits. So either proprioceptive or sensory deficits would be correct in your fill-in-the-blank question. Right. So hopefully that gave you a nice overview of augmented feedback and instruction. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me. If not, please remember that you're getting 5 points extra credit where you need it. So I know that some of us have totally lost control of our Learn Smart modules, and could really use any help we can get. And of course, it does look good to me that you've actually achieved that, so that when you do go ask for something, I can say, yeah, they definitely put an effort in. All right, so just keep that in mind, and if you do get a chance, please check this hyperlink out. You would just play the PowerPoint and then select this link to view it. I think it's very interesting. All right, I'm sorry I could not be with you in class today, but take care, and I will see you next week.